Yes, sir, baby. We are back at it again. Week 1 of the CDL is officially in the books. And today we're going over the biggest takeaways from every single team this weekend, because we are still learning a lot about the meta, about how these teams play, about individual players, about these rookies, and so much more. So there's a lot to go over with so much insane Call of Duty to happen this weekend. Without further ado, let's get right into this one. Let's go. So the first thing is to really talk about how big of a meta change there was in Search and Destroy going into this weekend. Obviously, at the kickoff event, there was a lot of talk about the snipers and the smokes and the gentleman's agreements. And the culmination of all of that conversation ended up in smoke grenades getting GA'd. So we saw the first S&D without smokes, but with snipers in this game this weekend. And then of course, Vanguard also finally patched the silent plant and defuse mechanics. So we actually had a silent plant and defuse for the first time in Vanguard this week. And really, that alone is a pretty massive meta change when it comes to bomb setups and how you plant in the second half of rounds, or how you play in the second half of rounds off of plants. Like, for example, like on Tuscan, you could sound whore the bomb top church and have a literal bomb defense by sitting top church, just waiting to hear someone hop on the bomb. And all of those small things massively changed the mental game of how pros are processing where players could be in the second half of rounds. And so there's a lot of things that were up in the air, specifically in Search and Destroy this weekend. So that's something to definitely note when breaking down the results of S&D this weekend. The first team that we gotta talk about is one of the hardest teams to understand in the CDL right now, and that's the Florida Mutineers. Obviously, they got a rookie on their team, Dave Patty, and they brought in Vivid in the offseason with Awakening and Skies. And this weekend, they lost 3-0 to London in their first series. Got a really weird series overall and got pretty much smoked on a lot of those maps. And then they ended up beating Paris 3-1. So they had a weird weekend overall. In the kickoff event, Florida looked pretty good, beating LAG, competing really close with Toronto a handful of maps, beating them on a map as well. And Skies looked like an absolute unit in the kickoff event, but in that first series against London, Skies was getting body bagged. And that was a real question mark after how dang good he had looked originally. They had looked so good on like Berlin S&D, or just S&D in general in the kickoff event, and that did not seem to be the case this weekend. For example, like Dave Patty was a first blood unit in the kickoff. That was not the case in this event. And then against London specifically, they were just getting smoked in like control and hardpoint. It was bad. So in the match against Paris, which, you know, of course we'll talk about Paris in a second, but you know, Paris competed with Atlanta FaZe. They nearly beat them. And Florida beat them on Gavutu, which is a map that Paris has been very, very good on. Awakening was absolutely cracked, and they nearly 100-point clubbed Paris in the hard point on Tuscan. And even in that first map on Bocage against Paris, we saw Vivid absolutely frying. He went 46 and 34 in that map. So we saw like pop-off moments from Vivid, Skies, and Awakening throughout this weekend, only in that one series. And then we also have seen Dave Patty dominate in Search and Destroy this year already. So it's like, you know, the upside that this team could potentially have, but they've only beat LAG, who at the kickoff event didn't look very impressive. And then they've now beat Paris. So we need to see a lot more of them before we make any real judgments. Man, there's a lot of question marks still with how consistent this team can be and what this team would look like when facing the most elite competition in the CDL. All right, so next up, let's talk about the Boston Breach. Their only match this weekend was against LAG, where they ended up winning 3-2 in a really, really competitive series. We continue to see those moments of high upside slaying from Capsule and those sparks of what could be some insane gun skill for sure, like what we saw in Berlin in the kickoff event. Then we saw it on Bocage here, but they ended up losing that Bocage map. But you can definitely see that if this starts clicking overall as a squad, the slang from Capsule could be pretty insane. So there's a lot of potential there for him individually. And then we even saw Tish looking really, really good on Bocage. And then in S&D, Tish was even sniping a little bit on Tuscan. And there was some like really just overall impressively patient plays from Tish, and the gun skill and the gunplay from him was awesome. He ended up going like 12 and 5 in that Tuscan S&D. The Capsule was like 9-0 to start, and they looked really great on Tuscan specifically. So I really like how this team plays S&D. That was a big takeaway from the kickoff event as well, even against LAG, was how well Nero was playing for map control and pushing up the map and being a nuisance and playing fast and playing with his team. And so I think Boston has a lot of potential still to be a really good S&D team. We saw a lot of that potential here in that series. Then we saw the big comeback on Gavutu, and then it went to a game 5 on Berlin. Again, and they end up clutching up and playing some really good S&D in that game. So I still want to see a little bit more when it comes to the hard point consistency from this team, but I think this team's going to be pretty dang good here in stage 1, right there in the mix, probably like that top 6-ish range. So now let's talk LAG then, because like I said, lost 3-2 to Boston, and then they won 3-1 against NYSL. And the narrative of this whole weekend was Hook and Asim being the guys, like doing the work for this team. We really saw that, especially in the second series against NYSL, because that was insane. Really, Hook just continues to play like Hook. He loves slang, playing a little ratty, making sneaky plays to flip spawns, get behind people, but also nasty gun skill. And like, we even saw Slasher in that hard point against Boston going off at the end, converting kills and like finding the pieces to end up winning that map. I walked away really impressed with LAG overall, and we saw Gunless being icy with the clutches, and then we really saw Asim pick up the slang potential in that control on Gavutu with that 11 spree when he really regained after having the slow start. And then Asim took over on Berlin, went on a 13 kill streak. Hook went 38 and 25. And so that's like the SMG slang you'd really been waiting to see from LAG. And so you really see that potential in that comeback win in that Berlin, even though they ended up losing in the S&D. So I'm still not sure how this team's gonna play in Search and Destroy. They seem a little discombobulated still, but again, we think that a team like that's headed by Slasher would figure that out eventually. Honestly, with how they played against NYSL and like coming out and 6-0ing NYSL on Berlin, and in that first hard point on Berlin, Hook went 30 and 19. And I loved how they used the streaks to break P4. And there was just some really impressive plays from them there, which I'm sure I'll talk about in a Learn from the Pros video at some point this week or next week maybe. Then we saw on Control, that on Tuscan, Asim was absolutely cooking. I mean, my goodness, he went 42 and 27 for the L. That's what you get excited to see is the upside slaying against a team of talented SMGs and Neptune and Hydra. I mean, if Hook and Asim can keep that up, LAG's ceiling is right up there with the best teams in the league. Overall, gotta be happy with LAG and a little bit worried about New York, which we can talk about right now. So New York lost 3-0 to Seattle and then lost 3-1 to LAG. So they went 0-2. And like in that Seattle series, they were in the blender at times. It was really tough. Like there was that listening on Tuscan where you heard Crim saying like, yo guys, calm down. Our comms are way too crazy, talking like Hydra and Neptune. And it was just a weird overall interaction. Clay was really struggling. And so I definitely have some worries about their performances in hardpoint right now. But we also heard that Neptune had a thumb injury. It was like an infection in his thumb. Apparently wasn't able to scrim as much this week as they wanted to. So that could have affected how they played. And the bow cage against Seattle came down to around 11. And, you know, Clay got pissed because they let Seattle get the bomb down. And so there's still a lot of room for New York to grow. I think they'll be fine in the long term. The S&D was definitely ugly overall against LAG on Berlin, where like Hydra tried to snipe and they were getting first blooded all game long. Hydra went 1-6, Neptune went 0-6. And then you go to that Control on Tuscan against LAG, and that's where you finally saw what you wanted to see from Hydra, because he went like 40 and 27 in that Control. They ended up winning it. He's absolutely cooking and frying. And so like that's what you're hoping to see from this team led by a slaying Hydra and Neptune. So we need to see more from Neptune specifically. Clay did not play his best CoD in either of these two series. And so in the long term, I'm sure they'll be fine, but it seems like they still got a little bit of work to do here in the next few weeks. So then let's talk about Seattle then, because my goodness, boys, Seattle is out here doing it. My word. Because I mean, obviously everybody's question after the kickoff event was like, is this a fluke? They answered with an emphatic no, it is not a fluke. We are here to stay. They smoked NYSL 3-0. And again, Sib and Pred, like, bro, come on, man. These guys have been frying. And these two series specifically highlighted Sib as like a legit elite slayer. At least early on here in Vanguard, he is the man. Versus NYSL and Tuscan, Sib went 39 and 22. The rotations and the gunfights really on the rotation were just on point. They were nice. And it was just an interesting game. There were some nasty gunfights even from Sib in that S&D on Bow Cage where he snapped for some 2 pieces, like specifically that one on River. And then that ice up in round 11. So it's just like, then from Pred, you see exactly what you'd expect from him after the kickoff event. Slaying inside Control, 37 and 27 in Gavutu Control, where he's just so quick at getting up into the spawn. He's so good at capitalizing on those opportunities the defense gives him to push up the map. And then he really capitalizes on that. Had over 4,000 damage in that game, which is insane. So they are demons to play against right now. If someone said right now Sib's the best player in the game, I mean, it's a pretty dang good argument, especially after their 3-2 win against Toronto, which came down to the wire. Round 11, ninja defuse basically by accuracy. Not totally a ninja defuse, but you know what I mean. The defuse in the 2v2, which was just a really smart heads up play from Seattle, showing how good they are at keeping track of players. And like they beat Toronto 6-1 on the bow cage S&D. And like, we'll talk about that in a second, but Cammy went 0-6 in that map. So it's like, they're doing some things that other teams haven't done since the stage 1 of Cold War against Toronto. So that definitely goes to show how talented Seattle is. And if there's any question if Seattle's gonna be a competitive team for at least a while, they're gonna be a competitive team throughout stage 1. And you know, we'll see if they can keep it up, but it seems like they're going to, at least in the short term, for a while with how talented these guys are naturally. As for Paris specifically, what a weird weekend for them. I mean, that match versus FaZe came down to the freaking wire. 3-2. They beat FaZe on Gavutu hardpoint and Gavutu control, which we'll talk about in a second from FaZe's POV. But Paris is legit good at Gavutu. They beat LA Thieves on Gavutu control as well in the kickoff event. So they're definitely very good on Gavutu, and FaZe felt that specifically. And like legitimately, it felt like John and Temp, like it was like turning back the clock. Like it was back in BO4 or, you know, World War II or whatever with those guys. Temp went 25-15 on Gavutu, and then John went 25-18. And then the control, Temp went 22-13, John went 22-16. They were absolutely cooking FaZe in those maps. And then John even made some clutch plays like that Berlin map 5v FaZe in the 2v1, and like even against Florida, we had that clutch in round 11 from John. So then after that first series, you're kind of like, okay, wait a second here. Is Paris legit this good? They play against Florida and you're like, okay, we're gonna learn something here. Either Florida is in real trouble or Paris maybe isn't as good as they looked against FaZe. Florida took them to the woodshed in that map for Tuscan. I mean, it could have been like a 60-point club for a while there. They ended up avoiding the 100-point club, but it was just barely. And Florida looked unbelievable. So at this point, Paris at least has upside, but specifically it's on Gavutu. So we'll see if teams just try to avoid Gavutu against them and if that really limits them in the future here. But that's probably the thing to watch for when you're looking for Paris. So as for FaZe, what they learned is that they should just never ever play Gavutu ever again. Like, it's literally insane. Obviously right now it's impossible to avoid Gavutu control fully, because right now whoever wins the coin toss gets to veto the control map or choose the control map basically. So since there's only 2 maps, you don't really get a choice if you lose the coin toss. So they're praying to avoid Gavutu controls from here on out, but they're not gonna be playing Gavutu hardpoint probably ever again, at least not for a while. And shocker, Celium's really good. If you guys watch, I mean, like that bow cage hardpoint versus LA Thieves was insane. They might be upgrading the meta here with how they played that Gavutu that bow cage hardpoint, because they had 2 ARs out. And for FaZe, you're like, why would FaZe have 2 ARs out? But if you pay attention to how Celium and RCDs played on the map together, I mean, me and Shift were doing a watch party together, which, you know, hang out for the watch parties, it's a blast. But we were talking about it live. We're like, yo, this is crazy with how RCDs and Celium like aren't even close to each other on the map at all throughout this game. They're just playing lines of sight and narrowing the map down for Simp and for aBeZy to really thrive and give him a lot of information. But we even saw Celium absolutely frying, and he was finding kills in the hill from like crazy angles. And like, even though he wasn't playing close to the hill, he was using an AR and long lines of sight towards the hill to really, really maximize the automaton in his hand, and he was frying because of it. So I think FaZe may have unlocked a new level on bow cage, and I'd imagine teams are gonna really avoid playing FaZe on bow cage from here on out, because the Tiny Terrors, the freak of nature and the freak of humanity, Celium and RCDs, I mean, you want to avoid them on a map like bow cage, to say the least. All right, OpTic fans, it's time. We got to talk about this team. What in the world? They're 0-2, boys. They're 0-2. OpTic Texas is 0-2, losing to London 3-2, losing to the Rocker 3-2. And it feels like the second that they think like, we got this, you know, that's when they have a problem. After the first 2 maps against London, Scump bounced back map 1 on bow cage after his tough kickoff event. And you're like, okay, they're good. Scump's back in rhythm. Then they win the round 11 on Berlin to go up 2-0, and you're like, okay, this is easy dub. See you later, London. But then London just comes out in the control frying, and Illy really struggled. He went 13-26 in that control, and they just couldn't get London out of their power positions. Like, lack of coordination to really identify those guys. Nades weren't connecting, just not able to get London out of their spawn. The Berlin hardpoint didn't go well, and then you go into a bow cage, round 11, and Shotzi wraps through tunnel. They end up losing the round 11. It just seems like they're really uncomfortable with their bomb setup still after the silent plant defuse is eliminated. And also, those guys really liked smoke grenades. Shotzi loved having that smoke grenade. So there's gonna be some time to get used to how they play without smokes now. Against the Rocker, OpTic put on a slaying masterclass in map 1. And so you're like worried for the Rocker at that point. You're like, oh no, like this is gonna get ugly really quick. And then Shotzi, like Shotzi went 34-18. Illy went 26-15. So you're like, oh no, when the Empire guys are doing that to you, you're gonna have some problems. They outslayed Rocker by 23 kills on the map. So you're like, okay, this is gonna be a good series for OpTic. You go into an S&D and it was just a really bad time. OpTic lost 6-1. A lot of credit to Rocker for playing for mid-map control and doing a lot of really good things there. OpTic just seems really uncomfortable in S&D and very impatient. They weren't willing to get mid-map control. And so there just seems to be something disconnected there. I did like that Dashy was the one sniping now instead of Illy, which was something we talked about last week after Illy was sniping on Desert Siege when Dashy was the one playing the island spots. That makes no sense. And so it was nice to see Dashy sniping. This squad of 4 to be not playing well in Search and Destroy is shocking, to say the least. Then, you know, they go onto the Tuscan. They look really good on the Tuscan control. Then you go into that Berlin hardpoint, still a problem for them, and they have over 100-point lead and lose it. Oh no. It's like, if you're an OpTic fan, I'm sure you're losing full out there. They're up by like 100 at one point and basically end up and blow the lead on Berlin. And then they lose a round 11 on Berlin S&D. Again, it's just uncomfortable with how to get the bomb down, how to deal with retaking bombs without smoke grenades. They don't have all of those strats down yet. And Rocker had some really brilliant setups there. We'll probably talk about that in a Learn from the Pros video this week as well. But my goodness, there are some major problems there that OpTic has to identify in Search and Destroy. I think a lot of that stems from their discomfort with planting the bomb, and that was really evident on Tuscan with their lack of commitment to planting the bomb. And we even saw that a little bit on Berlin. When they planted the bomb, shocker, they won the rounds. They're not very good at capitalizing on that time that they do have to plant the bombs. And so I think they're gonna really have to focus on that here moving forward. And that's something that I'll definitely be watching for and identifying in the future about how they actually work towards those plans. So now as for London, London's in a really interesting spot now after this win against Florida, win against OpTic. They're 2-0 in their groups right now, and we saw the gizmo we've been waiting to see. He was frying on Gavutu hardpoint against Florida. Then we saw Zero sniping and looking fantastic. Clinical S&D from them with Afro roaming on Desert Siege. That looked really good. And they had 7 straight first bloods against Florida in all those rounds in the 6-1 win. And then Zero was slaying on Gavutu control. So like, there's a lot of really positive signs here for London. And then icing up in the round 11s when they needed to. You could not be happier with this squad, and they finally showed their top 5, top 6 potential, and they showed it quicker than I thought they would after their kickoff event performance. But again, the narrative makes sense for London to be good because they played Seattle in that first match in the kickoff tournament. So we had no idea how good Seattle was. It was their first match on LAN with all of these guys, Afro and Nasty and Gizmo. And so did I think they'd turn it around this quickly? No, but my goodness, this team's gonna be scary from here on out, and a team that no one can take lightly. They're legit right there in the mix, top 6, top 5, who knows, maybe even higher now with this roster. So as for Toronto specifically, I don't think there's too much to worry about in the long term here. They lost 3-2 in an insanely close series. Obviously they were really outplayed in those first 2 maps against Seattle, and like that Bocage S&D is again 6-1. Cammy went 0-6. That's not what you'd expect to see. But again, S&D, if you ever to say that there's a fluky event of S&D, it's gonna be this one. In the long term, Toronto's gonna be fine once they get that S&D meta kind of figured out here after they go through some film. see what teams are doing. I'm sure they're going to be fine. You know, when they're winning maps like on Control Gavutu, even when they're outslayed. One thing though is that teams are going to probably start to learn to not play Berlin against Toronto. So they're going to have to start developing their map pool here, assuming teams want to avoid playing Berlin, because Bance loves Berlin and they have dominated every team they played on it basically. So the one problem there was basically the big difference in the game against Seattle was that they gave Accuracy a glide bomb in round 9 when Insight, I don't even, whether he didn't realize that Accuracy was on the streak or he was just going to try to chow Accuracy to get the kill, but it was a pretty bad chow and gave him a glide bomb, which ended up being a pretty big difference in the game. So there's some small mistakes here that were the difference, and I'm sure in the long term, they'll be just fine. So as for LA Thieves as well, again, I don't think there's that much to worry about with this team. They still look very solid. They lost 3-1 to FaZe, another insane Tuscan hardpoint. Like, they are the league leaders in insane Tuscan hardpoints. I mean, every time they play Tuscan, it's like the most insane hardpoint. It was 252-48, and what I was surprised about is that they had Desert Siege against FaZe, but I think that's a pretty good matchup to have against FaZe, especially after how good LA Thieves looked on Desert Siege against Paris in the kickoff event. Overall, they lost 6-4, and then they got body bagged in Control on Tuscan by FaZe, and so we started to see FaZe catch their rhythm here in this match, where FaZe smoked him in the Control on Tuscan, then FaZe smoked him on Bocage Bocage Hardpoint. I think LA Thieves is still right there as a top 5 type team, but FaZe definitely found their groove there in that match, and you're gonna start getting a little bit worried about how good FaZe can be moving forward here in the next few weeks. So the Minnesota Rocker though, my goodness, I don't know what to think about this team. They beat OpTic 3-2, obviously. They got absolutely smoked on map 1, like we said, completely outslayed by like 22 kills, but then it looked so good in the S&D on Tuscan, and you loved how they established mid-map control. That was kind of the key for teams this week, was establishing mid-map control on Tuscan, and then Attach started turning up on that control on Tuscan. The only difference there was that Sandy had streaks but wasn't able to call him in that round 5, which was the reason for why they ended up losing that map. And then they had the insane comeback on Berlin Hardpoint, even though they didn't play well for the first half, and so they ended up clutching up in the round 11 on Berlin, S&D. So it's just so hard to tell who this team is. I'm not sure who this team is, honestly. I'm definitely still concerned about their slaying upside inside of Hardpoint specifically, and so we need to still see a more consistent Attach and Priesta when it comes to slaying in Hardpoint specifically. But their S&D potential is still absolutely there. They could still be a top 3 or 4 S&D team all year long for sure. So it just feels like that team's gonna have to win by being good at control and winning S&Ds and winning a lot of game 5s this year, but that could definitely be the case. And it seems like a very similar story to last season for this team potentially. I'm not convinced by the Rocker yet. They're in that top 6 conversation, but OpTic is probably the bigger question mark right now for sure. So there it is, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. That's the takeaways. The podcast will have a lot longer conversation about a lot of these teams and predictions for this upcoming weekend with some wild matchups as well. So make sure to check that out. Check out the most recent video here, Learn from the Pros video, breaking down strats from last week. I think it was a really dope video. You can learn a lot as well from that and how these pros and these teams are actually playing. And I'll talk to you guys very soon. Peace.